Welcome to the Wise Idea Weekly Podcast with Christopher J. Harris, focusing on life, leadership, family, marriage, and the church. We are providing tools for our inspiration and wisdom for life. Our goal is to inspire everyday people to live wise lives. If you're new to us, we release a brand new podcast weekly on Thursdays. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode. Here's our host, Christopher J. Harris.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Wise Idea Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher J. Harris, and I'm so excited to have you tuned in today. It's another week. It's another opportunity to inspire, to offer wisdom. And you heard our announcer say it already. Our goal is to inspire everyday people to live wise lives. And of course, that means that we've got to provide some strategies for those hearts to be inspired and those heads to be wise. And I tell you, if there was an energy drink for podcasts, I think I just took one, because our guest that's on today is going to help us unpack so much stuff. I have such a high level of respect for him. I feel like he's a walking encyclopedia, so much information, so much knowledge, so much data. And not just the data, but he understands the why behind the data. And all this month, this particular series of podcasts, we have been focusing on how can we defend the church? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I got to tell you, I've been saying it already. I'm in love with the local church. I believe that it is still a part of God's answer for our world. And I believe that, yes, there are some issues we got to work on, but that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we've got to talk about it. We've got to figure it out. We've got to work through it. We've got to embrace these challenges. And as Pastor Andy Stanley said one time, let's run towards the tension. And so that's what we're doing through these episodes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have the Dr. Warren Byrd on the Wise Idea Podcast. I have officially made it, y'all. I've officially made it. I've got Dr. Byrd on. How are you, sir?
Well, I have a big smile. When you hear an intro like that, you're either 6 feet over or 6 feet under the ground. And so I'm still over, and I'm just gritting. I look forward to where this conversation is going to go.
Well, listen, I'm so happy to have you on. And of course, I met Dr. Byrd for the first time in 2011 in person. And since that time, I am a huge fan of his. I can't say that I've read all of his books. He's got, ladies and gentlemen, he has written 30 books to his credit. And he's got a lot more in him, I'm sure. But he is the go-to guy for many people when it comes to church research and church data. And you can go to his website. I'm going to put it in the show notes and see his long bio and all of his credentials. I don't want to spend a lot of time reciting the credentials on the podcast. I want to spend more time hearing from him and hearing what's in his head and what he's been seeing and sensing as we today embrace this conversation around the challenges that the church faces. So again, Dr. Byrd, thank you for being on today. I'm so honored to have you. Pastor
Christopher, it is a delight.
Yes, sir. All right, so let's jump into the deep end of the pool. First of all, let's talk about what you have been seeing and sensing have been the major issues that the church is facing today. What are just some of those big bucket, makes you cringe things that the church is wrestling with?
Let's wrestle with the U.S. church, in particular, yes, at least North American, and the Protestant slice of that pie. And one of the things that we really struggle with is consumerism, that we go to receive and not to give, that so much of our lives are all about what's in it for me. And we carry that into our spirituality. And pastors and leaders struggle every week. How do I help us see that the focus is not about me, but about our amazing creator of the universe, who we want to glorify and who we want to help populate heaven at every opportunity.
That's amazing. I think you're exactly right. The other day I was reading a blog post by Sky Jethani. I'm sure you're familiar with Sky. And he was really digging into this notion of consumerism and consumer Christians. And so it was really, really challenging, even from a pastoral standpoint, to figure out how do we disciple people differently so that they can throw that consumerism away. But they're getting so many messages every day.
Yes. And let me throw another one. It's the culture and Christianity. We are moving rapidly from a culture that reinforced, that helped the church out. The public morality was very much in sync with biblical morality. And so, in a way, the church didn't have to do our job because we had other structures in society that were helping reinforce our message. And now those other structures are often challenging the message. And Christians are needing to articulate the why, W-H-Y, of what is it God is calling us to be? How is it different? And how do we say that in a way that connects meaningfully with the needs and the searches of today's generation? And that's an ongoing challenge, not only for pastors, but then as pastors are equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry, that we're all given the responsibility to be the voice of Jesus in answering challenges that come our way. So your opening phrase of the church defending is really the church needing to find ways to take the offensive without so many allies as we've had in the past.
So getting on the offensive rather than being defensive.
Well, look at Jesus. Every person he shared the gospel with, to use an expression from today, he did it differently. I mean, there's Nicodemus in chapter 3 of John, where Jesus was blunt and to the point. The very next chapter, the woman at the well, look at a totally different approach he took. Look through the book of Acts at all the different ways, depending on who the audience was and the context and the receptivity, that the gospel was proclaimed in the message. And we all need to be alert and astute and skilled with different ways of voicing our faith.
Wow. So Dr. Byrd, let me ask you. So you've already listed out, 3 to 4 different ideas, and I know that you're probably going to throw out some more. What are the numbers saying today about the church, the vitality of the church, the future of the church, where the church currently is? Because the truth is, and I know that there's a lot of people that are listening to my podcast, they read the newspaper on a regular basis, and that could be everything from their local paper to the national papers like the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times or the USA Today, or, whether it's conservative or liberal or whatever. That's not really the point there. But I do believe that there's so much quote unquote data that we see or hear about that may not always be accurate. It may not always have the right context, but I think I trust when I see your name associated with data and numbers. So what are you seeing? What are the numbers saying?
Well, first let's talk about the state. Well, first let me comment about the media and publicity. What makes news is something that's contrary to what's happening or something negative or scandalous. So let's just take the issue of pastoral succession. You're never going to see a headline that says 5 years later, XYZ church still doing great after the baton pass of its pastors. What's news about that? Well, the fact is that happens. What makes the news is when there is a disastrous succession or when there's some scandalous issue that's associated with it. And it's so easy to think, because that grabs the news highlight, that that's what's happening everywhere. Likewise, church. It's easy to hear about the nuns, meaning no religious affiliation, or the de-churched, those that would be those who were part of a church and have dropped out, or any other identifiable group, and say, wow, we're just falling off a cliff. Now, the actual numbers from the last 40, 50 years is that the percent of people who are in church, who attend church, is the same percent. Now, but let me qualify that. Do they come as frequently? No. That number is dropping. So, when I was a kid, there were perfect attendance pins of people who were there 52 Sundays a year. Well, now your most active people are there 2 or 3 weeks. And hey, I may be one of those. And I'll tell you, I'm in church wherever I go on a Sunday, whenever possible, but it just may not be the church where I'm a member. I may be with our kids who live in another town or whatever. So you have frequency issues. You have theology issues. Certain churches, and today it's the more evangelical stream, broadly defined, are growing much more than the mainline or the old line churches. And so while it evens out for a net same percentage, who is growing and who is declining, it's not like it's all the same across the board. You have issues of the age of in the congregation versus the age in your community. I had just read a book by Lee Kricher, Kricher, on how he was called to a church, and he said, great, I'll do it on one condition. You're about 20 years older than your community. I'll come if you'll agree to let me do whatever it takes while still being faithful to the gospel to transform how we do church so that we reach our congregation. The average age in the congregation is the same as the average age in the surrounding community. So the reality is, nationally, churches are just inching up and getting a little older year by year than the congregation. That's an issue. The aging of senior pastors. The average senior pastor in a Protestant church is somewhere around 52. Now, why does that matter? Because what your age, you tend to attract people that are maybe 5 years younger in life stage. So, for example, if I'm preaching, if I got kids in diapers, and I use that as a sermon illustration, what kind of life stage of family is going to be drawn into the church? It's those who are just getting married, just starting their families, or vice versa, or on another level. I'm teaching about, I'm using teenager illustrations because of my teens. Who's the most likely to come? It's those with preteens who are saying, hey, there's going to be a killer youth group in this church because the pastor's kids are in it, and we want to be part of that. So those are just a few of the issues surrounding the overall number that attendance may be level, but there are troublesome signs underneath.
Dr. Byrd, for the benefit of those that are listening to this episode, give us some of just the basic foundational numbers in terms of how many churches are there in the United States, the average church size, the average salary for the average pastor, how many average denominations are there in the United States, that kind of thing. Because I think those numbers even would be helpful for people to have a context for some of the things that they hear and see and sense that's happening.
Pastor Christopher, you have hit my sweet spot. So across the United States, it's hard to identify an exact number because do you count a storefront church as a church? Do you count a house church as a church? Do you count a multi-site church that's across a big geographic spread? Is that one church or more? So researchers would generally agree about 320 to 340,000 churches in the United States, of which the vast majority are Protestant. Now, you say, but wait a minute, I thought there were more Catholics than Protestants. That's in terms of people, because the average Catholic church is almost like a megachurch in terms of they go for big parishes and, multiple services and all, whereas the average median Protestant church last weekend had about 86 people. And so that's why there are so many more Protestant churches than Catholic churches. Now, you say, but wait a minute, I'm used to all these big churches around. Well, let me ramp you up. If you average about 200 on a weekend, adults and children, noses, not counting anyone twice, however many services you have. Don't count the internet service, though. We'll come back to that. That's another trend. but actual noses. If you hit 200 people, you're in the 80th percentile in terms of church size. If you hit 400 people, you're in the 90th percentile. Now, jump all the way up to what are called megachurches, and that's a word for an artificial barrier of 2,000 and higher. 2,000 and higher, adults and children, typical weekend, all physical campuses. There are only 1,650 such churches. I just saw your eyes widen up as I said, because we're so used to when you put a picture in the newspaper or anything of seeing something really big and thinking, well, that's a typical church. No. So if you do by math of 1,600 out of 320,000, that is half of 1% of churches. But let me flip it the other way. In those churches, last weekend, of those who went to a Protestant church, almost 1 out of 10 people went to a megachurch. That's because a church of 4,000 on a weekend, how many churches of 86 would fit into that? So 1 out of 10, and if you pull it down to about 1,000 and up, that's 1 out of every 5 people last weekend went to a very large church. So you have a wide variety of range of sizes and of strengths. A smaller church can do things really well that a larger church can't. And a larger church can do things really well that a smaller church can't. And that's enough of an overview. You want more?
Yeah, let's keep digging. So you talked about the internet audience. We're gonna come back to that. So let's deal with that whole new phenomenon. And then let's deal with, I know that you worked with a number of organizations out there that deal with stewardship stuff on a regular basis, even the one that you're currently working with now. Let's because we're putting it out there today, right? Let's talk about the nitty-gritty of what is the average pastor's package, or staff's package. Because I think when, and it's interesting, I love to hear your perspective about that media earlier when you talked about what makes the news and what doesn't. It's sort of that illustration that I often use, that you only hear about the planes that crash. You don't hear about the thousands and thousands that take off and land every single day, right? And so we hear about the pastors that have the mansions, or the pastors that are going on vacation in, the islands, or the pastor that has the private jet or jets, the pastor that has, all of that. And that's not limited to one racial group. I mean, we see that kind of innuendo across the board. So let's talk about that. Let's clarify for people, because I'm thinking about some of those pastors who are, even let's talk about the numbers of how many pastors are bivocational even. So yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. So you've raised a lot of great issues, Pastor Christopher. Let me deal with first the numbers of salaries. Outliers, like you gave the example of the extravagant pastoral salary, are just that. They are outliers, but they make the news, and nowadays they make TV shows that want to highlight certain extremes in pastoring. If you want, the generality is that across the board of church sizes, about half of a church's budget goes to staffing costs. That's on average. That's not right or wrong, but that's the average. And that really doesn't change much by church size. So from a church of 150 to a church of 15,000, about half the budget goes to staffing costs, and that would be salary, benefits, and so forth. Now, for the
taxes are included in that. All of that is what you're talking about, correct?
The Social Security portion of the tax that the church pays, yes. But this would be, what I'm paying everyone plus their hospitalization, retirement, maybe there's a book allowance, education allowance, and so forth. So, no, I take those last two out because those aren't coming. Now, they may or may not come to the pastor. So, as taxable income. I'm getting myself in trouble. So let me just back off that last statement and refer you to all the wonderful written literature, especially by the place I now work for, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. every year there is a Zondervan tax guide by our president, Dan Busby, and his team. And there is sound, wise advice for how to do your taxes ethically. And by the way, that's the whole way that ECFA, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, got started, was about 40 years ago when there were all these televangelist scandals. Senator Mark Hatfield, among others, came to some of the big name Christian ministries and said, look, either you guys police yourselves or we will do it. And so what they did, and this was the era when Billy Graham had just said, you know, we have to, and if you know of the Modesto Manifesto, when they were in Modesto, California, and he said, you know, this is how ministries like ours go south. The Bible calls us to be above reproach. What do we need to do? So a lot of people were talking about this. They got together and they came up with what's today 7 standards of financial and leadership integrity, such as one of them being family members don't set the pastor's salary. You know, because in some churches you have a family dominant board and they decide the salaries, and you know this is hardly independent or unbiased or I would say not even biblical. But anyway, there's great literature out there on how to do things legally, ethically, above board at ecfa.org. And there's lots of free stuff. I mentioned a book just a second ago, but there's a lot of free stuff on, you know, how do I develop an appropriate cash reserve for our church? How do we, whatever, guide you there. Now, so that's the positive side of, you know, how do we get to a healthier place? The negative outliers are the ones that make the news, but in my previous hat at Leadership Network, we did survey large churches, and there's a free report there at leadnet.org/salary, as in leadershipnetwork.org, leadnet.org/salary. You can get a free download of what are the latest trends and all. But I asked, and I ran those surveys, so I asked a lot of questions that were parallel to what non-big churches had asked. And then people were willing to share their databases with me, so I could see, you know, from a church of 50 up to a church of 50,000, what are the trends? And here, the best predictor of a pastor's salary by far is the income level of the church. Meaning, oftentimes a smaller church wants to pay its pastor more, but just can't. And the larger the attendance of the church, which leads to a larger giving. But, you know, you're in an urban context, Pastor Christopher, in your own. So, you know, your urban church may have more budget challenges than a church that's ministering to people in a wealthier suburban community. So it's not just size, which is why it's actually budget of the church that's the best predictor by far of what the salary will be. And as the church budget goes up, the salaries go up. And that's kind of the way it works, at least in the United States. And my favorite thing about doing the surveys for Leadership Network was I get this, you know, an email from a pastor in the Philippines who say, well, that's not how we do it at all. You know, we have it. And I'm like, well, don't copy the American model. You look to the Bible and figure out what works for you in your culture and teach us something then.
I love that. So what's the number that you have? How many pastors currently in United States, North American Protestant, et cetera, that may be bivocational? What's that percentage, do you believe?
And you're right. I don't have a number for that. And exponential.org that does this big church planting conference, which is pushing the whole bivocational and saying we're not going to get to where we need to be in terms of populating heaven until bivocational has a sexier name. That's not a very appealing name. The tent making, you know, is what the Apostle Paul modeled. That doesn't make sense to a lot of people today because we don't make many tents And so they have to be explained the analogy. So a new name will appear for someone who has a day job and, leads a church at the same time, a day job different than the church. And what that number is, I have no idea, and Exponential is trying to find out. But I do know this. I do know that the average size of church that can support a pastor full time goes up and up and up. In other words, long ago, if you had 10 families and they tithe, you could pretty much have a full-time pastor. Maybe you needed 15 to cover the building expenses and other things, but the pastors then were living more meagerly, and they tended to be way under the average income for the households in their church. Well, that's all turned on its head. Today, I'm going to guess somewhere between 100 and 200 attendance is a cutoff for viably supporting full-time a pastor. And that means where the spouse doesn't have to work. If the spouse wants to work, that's another thing. But where if the pastoral family is committed to living on the church income alone for medical and compensation and even long-term planning, that some is being set aside by the church for retirement eventually and the like, it's somewhere between 100 and 200, which is way higher than it was in yesteryear, and that number continues to inch upward.
Wow. My head is just like I feel like a geek in a candy store, a kid in a candy store. Like I'm having so much fun listening to you today. So let's talk about this internet audience, these online campuses. That is a whole other ball of wax. And for those that are listening to this episode, and it's interesting that you're bringing this up, Dr. Byrd, because I did close to 7 episodes last month, actually, on how social media has changed our lives. And several of those individuals that I had on focused specifically on the church and how social media and technology has changed what we do in the church. So let's dig into that a little bit. What are you sensing and seeing and would love to share?
The internet churches, people tried them early on, and there was mixed feedback, and they kind of declined in popularity until the technology in the last few years has made it possible. I mean, you can just do Facebook Live, which has a little complication because Facebook then owns your broadcast, not you. But there are many ways you can very easily either audio, like I'm part of a church that's, last weekend we had right at 100 people, but they they record the message, they put it online, and when I'm away, I would listen to it, and I wasn't the only one. So that's the earliest stage of an internet church, is making the message possible, first by audio and then by video, and then you complicate it or you add it further by having often a team of volunteers that do prayer requests and other ways of trying really to minister to the people who are out here. Here are the two interesting things that I'm hearing from churches that are having these surges in internet attendance lately. One is how much giving financially occurs from people watching online. Now with the rise of online giving in general, that's all part of it, but that makes it easier to give when I'm part of an online congregation. But just this whole idea that online churches are able often to support themselves if you were to parcel out what came in from that versus the staff and equipment needed to support it. The other is the incredible reach of an online church that, here you can be based in Tampa, Florida, and a student in Japan who's learning English can in some way, maybe came across one of your books or Pastor Tommy's books, found your ministry online and is listening and says, tell me more about Jesus. whoa, or in a closed country that you can't get to. So pastors are saying, man, I realize that it does help the family with the snotty-nosed kid not have to come to church, and maybe the family that doesn't want the hassle factor of fighting the traffic because Johnny's got a sports game right after church and it would have been complicated. But generally, they're reaching a lot more, and they're trying to figure out how can we leverage this to make true disciples of Jesus Christ.
That's amazing. All right, Dr. Byrd, let's shift gears just a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about some of the how do I want to say this? Some of the scandal that we see happening in church today. And I would include in that, we talked a little bit about this earlier, the succession issues, the integrity issues. We've got, of course, the politics of our day. And yeah, so let's talk about that really quickly. And I know our time is getting away from us. So
Man, I could talk all day. We may need to do another podcast. Let's boil it down to what you can do and where you can go. And first is a podcast like yours. I listen podcast listening again because it's become so easy. I worked out in the gym this morning. I listened to something as I was doing that. As I was doing dishes after breakfast, I listened to something else. Chances are before the end of the day, I'll listen to another podcast. So that if you are not a regular serial multiple podcast listener, there's lots of free learning out there. Take advantage of it. Also, leaders are readers. That may mean books, which I hope so, which is why I've contributed to 30 different books on multi-site and pastoral succession and healthy teams and other topics. But online, there's a lot of good stuff. So whose blog are you following? Who are you listening to? And if I can suggest two things, my current employer, ECFA, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, just go to ecfa.org/follow. And that will put you in touch with a lot of free resources from us. Make a discipline, not of letting your email box control you, but of you controlling your email box, but block time every day. Yes, for God's word directly, spend time there, but after that, keep learning because the culture is changing and you want to know how to speak the gospel with relevance to an ever-changing culture.
That's so true. Yeah. And we'll have you back to deal with some of those questions that we just kind of referenced. And I know, again, our time is getting away. Let me ask one final question of you. And that is, where does Dr. Byrd go to get his data?
I go to a wide range of things. An obscure academic conference of sociologists of religion. I'm a PhD, so I like to hang out with that crowd and talk statistical regression and other things. But more so, I'm a good reader. I just, like in prepping for this call, I read a book called American Religion, Contemporary Trends by Mark Chaves, Chaves. And yes, he's one of my buddies in my academic gathering, but he takes all the stuff that's out there and brings it down to what's really happening. So I listen to that. The other more fresher is Pew, P-E-W research. They just, as we're recording this podcast, they recently released something on why people do or don't go to church, to religious worship. And you can siphon out the church segment of it, and I learned that way. And I learned from friendships like you. Before we went on the air, Pastor Christopher, I asked you, what are you learning? What are you doing? What's happening? And it's hearing from people who are on the front lines that temper everything I read in the books and otherwise.
That's incredible. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. This is at least round one. I don't know if we'll be able to get him booked to get back on here again or not, but that's at least round one of this conversation of these real issues that are affecting the church. And I think today Dr. Byrd did a lot of debunking of some myths and ideas that are out there. And so, Dr. Byrd, thank you so much for being on today. For all of you that tune in every single week, thank you for tuning in to the Wise Idea podcast. Our announcer is going to come and tell you a lot more about our social media, how you can connect with us. Everything that Dr. Byrd said today, we're going to put in the show notes. There'll be links that you'll be able to follow and track along with what we spoke about today. We'll try to get him back on to finish this discussion. But in the meantime, I want to invite you, and I beg you, live wisely.
Thanks again for joining us on another episode of the Wise Idea podcast with Christopher J. Harris. We hope you enjoyed our time together. If you did and would like additional resources and information, you can find the previous episodes, show notes, featured guest information, and more at www.thewiseideapodcast.com. We also invite you to join the conversation on social media. The Wise Idea Podcast is on Twitter and Facebook. Find us at The Wise Idea and at our Facebook group, The Wise Idea Podcast. On Instagram, find us at The Wise Idea Podcast. Our host is also on social media. You can find him regularly on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Pinterest, all located at CJ Harris 1. Finally, if you enjoyed what you've heard, head over to iTunes and/or Google Play and leave a rating and review for other listeners to find us. Our podcast is also on Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for joining us. We will see you the next time. Live wisely.
Understanding. The same was the missing principal thing.